So the first figure I wanted to review is a figure that means a lot to me. It was my very first ever Kaiju figure I had as a child, before I actually even knew what Kaiju were, especially before I even knew what Godzilla was. But I basically found out through this figure, and it started off a huge obsession that exists still today. So the first figure I'm going to be looking at is the 1985 6-inch Imperial Godzilla. So when I'm looking at figures, I tend to look at certain things, and as this is a first review, I picked this figure because it has all the different areas that I would look to review. So first of all, I'm going to be talking about the sculpt. Now, with this figure, I mean, as a kid, I thought this was the coolest thing in the world, but looking back on it now, after having collected a lot more Godzilla figures, you kind of start to realize that the sculpt on this thing was pretty terrible. If you look at it, the skin's sort of nicely textured for an old figure like that, I suppose. The face is all right, I guess, and it's got all the elements. You can tell it's Godzilla. It's got the spines, it's got the, just the body shape and everything. You can tell who it is, but yeah, pretty poor sculpt. Although having said that, it is 1985, so I guess for the time it was pretty decent. But now there's plenty of much better figures than this guy. Not a lot much else I can say about the sculpt for this one, really, because I mean, you can see, I don't really need to point out any factory errors or anything, but yeah, it's nothing special when it comes to sculpting. Okay, so now I want to look at paint, the paint job. The paint's very striking on this, at least. It's a blend of sort of black and green with the silver metallic spikes and a silver patch on the chest. It does have these really weirdly red lips. I never understood this, even as a kid watching Godzilla movies. I never got the weird lip coloration. I mean, I always find it weird when people just assume Godzilla is green, because 90% of the time he's been like a dark blue or a black. He was green a couple of times in the Millennium era, I guess, and a couple of the Showa era ones, but he was never this green. This is but as I said, it's quite striking. It looks quite good in a way, the paint. It's bled over the years, and this one's faded quite a lot. I mean, under the arm, there's a lot more green on it, and the spikes were green, didn't have these, were silver, sorry, didn't have these green patches, as it does now. But as I said, I've had this a long time. I've had this since I was about 7 or 8, so it's been many, many, many years since I've had this figure. But yeah, the paint job's better than the sculpting, I would say, overall. Okay, so next for articulation. It's got pretty typical Kaiju figure articulation for vinyl figures anyway. His arms go 360 degrees. I mean, they get stuck a bit on the hip, but they can go. And that's the same for both arms. The legs do the same. I'll just show you with this one. Both legs will do that. And his tail is jointed there, and will also turn 360 degrees. So pretty good when it comes to articulation. The articulation is not too stiff and it's not too loose. So articulation is a big plus for this one because it's very well done. I mean, it's pretty basic, but it's very functional when it comes to its articulation. So now I want to look at detailing. As I said, this is kind of normally part of the sculpt, but there are certain elements of Kaiju figures that I want to talk about in a separate section. For example, the molding lines. Now, a lot of the Kaiju have seam lines where they're glued together. This isn't glued together there. This just looks like where it's come out of the mold or the sprue or whatever, but it is pretty noticeable, like on the neck there especially, and the chest coming down the stomach. And there, the sprue is very noticeable, but I suppose you can't really avoid that, especially with old figures. The hands, again, aren't very well cut out. The nails and stuff, they're just not very well. You can see that bits of sprue around either side of the finger, especially this finger here has sort of some sprue at the base there. But again, I kind of put it off with this figure because A, it is so nostalgic to me, and it is an old figure. But yeah, this is quite kind of shoddily detailed. Another thing I want to point out on the detailing of these figures when I do review them is just the company details and stuff on the bottom of the feet. So if we look at this foot here, his left foot has the copyright symbol and says 1985 Toho Company Limited, sorry. And his right foot has Imperial Hong Kong. Like I said, this was manufactured by a Chinese company called Imperial. They do quite a lot of these kind of figures, and there's quite a lot of bootlegs of this figure specifically, so you've got to be careful when you're buying this figure. To be fair, I've actually held a couple of the bootlegs, and they're not much different. But if you want a proper Imperial Kaiju, you've got to make sure that it has that, the Imperial Hong Kong mark, because otherwise it's just a bootleg. And as I said, if you're just after this figure as nostalgia, like say you had this as a kid and you don't anymore and you want to get it again, the bootlegs are pretty good, but if you want it from the point of view of a collector, it's probably best to make sure you have an official Imperial figure. So in terms of pricing and where I purchased this, it doesn't really apply to this figure, as I've had this figure since I was a small child and it was bought for me as a present by my parents. All I really remember about where this came from was when I was a child, there was this catalogue my family used to get, and I would circle things in the catalogue that I wanted for Christmas, and it would let my parents know what I was after for Christmas, and this was one of the things I circled. Now, at the time, I didn't know what Godzilla was. I circled this because as a kid, I was obsessed with dinosaurs, and this to me, as a kid, just looked like a cool fucking dinosaur with spikes on his back. He looks pretty badass. So as a kid, I thought, yeah, I really want that. Anyway, I got it, and a couple of years later, I was at a car boot sale, and I saw somebody selling similar kind of toy to this, and I think it might have been a different Imperial or maybe an Imperial bootleg of this figure, but I said to the guy selling it, I said, what exactly is this, because I have this, and you know, what kind of dinosaur is it? And he said, it's not a dinosaur, it's Godzilla. And I asked him what that was, and he told me it was films, etc. And I basically just started renting the films a lot from a video store I used to rent. I used to visit a lot as a kid. There's a particular rental store I used to visit every weekend, and after I found out that this came from a movie franchise, I used to rent all of the films from there. So as a kid, I rented all of the Showa films and most of the Heisei films. And obviously the second era of the Heisei, the second half of the Heisei era and all of the Millennium era was actually made after I found out about Godzilla, so I kind of saw them as they were coming out on the internet and things. The Millennium era especially, I watched mostly in high school, and caught up with the Heisei I missed in high school. So basically, yeah, ever since I was about 7 or 8, I've kind of been a huge Godzilla fan. But yeah, that's basically where I got this. I don't know how much it cost at the time, but I know they are available on eBay for anywhere between about £7 and about £20, depending on the seller. There is a 12-inch variant, which goes for a little bit more. But this, for the 6-inch version, which is this, anywhere between £5, £6 and £20, depending on the seller and the condition. Now, one thing I sort of forgot to mention with this figure is that it's not particularly based on any suit. All of the Godzilla figures, other figures I have anyway, are based on different suits from the series. This is not based on any particular suit. This seems to be based on an amalgamation of the Showa era suits. This figure is from 1985, so to the best of my knowledge, the Heisei era had just started, but I think, looking at this, I'm pretty sure it's based on an amalgamation of the Showa era, because I know for a fact it isn't based on a particular suit, and just based on my own knowledge of the series, I'd probably say it's based on multiple Showa suits at once. Now, speaking of Showa suits, I'm going to do some scaling now. So yeah, as I said, this stands roughly 6 inches, and the figure I'm going to compare it with is a figure from what I believe is a similar era. Well, what era I believe this figure to be from. And that is this 1968 Bandai Standard Soshingeki Goji. So this is the Soshingeki suit. And this is just for scaling, really, but you can see the height is really good. They scale up really well together. And they're pretty much in the same scale. A lot of this, I've got a 6-inch Bato Goji, and the head's a bit smaller, and it's a weird, because they're the same height, but the scaling looks a bit off because of the proportions. But this guy's actually proportioned really well with a Soshingeki suit. So yeah, it's actually got more articulation than Soshingeki, because this one's tail doesn't go. But yeah, if you look at the height comparison, they are very, very similar. So that's good. You know, this guy's going to scale up really well with your Bandai vinyl figures. So overall, my thoughts on the Imperial Godzilla, he's a great little figure for me. He's very nostalgic. He means a lot to me because this is where my love of Godzilla and Kaiju films came from. But overall, for new collectors, he's nothing particularly special. I wouldn't recommend him really, based purely on... If you're a collector who has nostalgia for this figure, then I wouldn't recommend him, to be honest. The sculpting's kind of bad, the paint job's kind of bad, the detailing's not great. But for me, it's something very special, and as this was the first episode, I kind of wanted to look at my very first ever Kaiju figure. So yeah, it's been a little introduction, and it's just I wanted to get something out that would show you how I'm going to review figures.